Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to introduce myself. My name is Vivian Garcia. I am a marketing manager with Bedford St. Martin's. And today we are very pleased to have Mike Palmquist, who will be presenting on our writing lives, our teaching lives, and generative AI, what's a caring teacher to do. I'm very happy to introduce Mike. So Mike, I'm going to use one of the bios that we have for you, and I'll have to update it with a little bit of new information because we didn't have it in the old one. And I actually might just start with that. But Mike is a professor of English at Colorado State University, and he's also a University Distinguished Teaching Scholar. He has also served as Associate Provost for Instructional Innovation and Director of the Writing Center. He is recognized internationally for his work in writing across the curriculum, the effects of computer network technologies on writing instruction, and new approaches to scholarly publishing. He's a founding editor of the WAC Clearinghouse, and I'm happy to share that URL later with everyone. And he's the author of numerous articles and essays on writing across the curriculum and writing and teaching with technology, as well as a member of the editorial boards of several journals. He is the author of Joining the Conversation, In Conversation, and the Bedford Researcher with Bedford. But the one tidbit I was saving was that he was just named at 4C's the Exemplar Award, the 4C's Exemplar Award. So just pretty much a lifetime achievement award, and we are very proud of Mike for that. Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us today.
Thank you. So I'm going to skip to the very beginning of this, if I can.
Oh, and Mike, one quick comment. Yeah. Jim Purdy said, fantastic, Mike, so well deserved. So I thought you'd like to hear that.
Thanks, Jim. So I'm kind of arranging my screen here so things go away. Let's see. I'm just going to give a quick overview. I'm going to do some observations about the origins and reactions to using generative AI, because it's been kind of interesting over the last, really 18 months, 16 months, however long it's been since ChatGPT came out in late 2023. So, and then we're going to talk a little bit about maybe how you get started using it, some things to think about, and some suggestions for teaching and some closing observations. And ideally, we'll have room for a discussion. So let's get going. Well, this is interesting because my keyboard is slow. If that happens, I'll just go back. So what is generative AI? So I'll just read this real quickly. Generative artificial intelligence, often referred to as generative AI or Gen AI, is a branch of artificial intelligence that focuses on creating new content. And it basically uses generative models to create all kinds of media, including text and video and audio. And they can learn from these large collections of data, really text more than anything else, but text, images, video, podcasts, anything that you could put into a computer and allow them to try to figure things out with. It really kind of started pretty recently, but I remember in my own experience working as the director of our online programs for the entire university, that I was constantly getting marketing emails and materials from companies that were telling me how I could automate the process of reviewing resumes or of generating letters of various kinds for business purposes. And so these things have really been around for a long time. And one of the books we're working on in the Clearinghouse right now by Mike Salvo and one of his colleagues is a series of case studies of people who have been working with these materials, including some image generators for more than a decade. So I think that's going to be a great book when we get that one out there. But you guys are familiar with chatbots and the text to video kind of things where you can just say, show me a video of somebody doing this, playing ping pong, for example, and it'll create a video for you. According to the text I'm reading now, generative AI has a wide range of applications across various industries. It goes on to list all those. However, it's important to be aware of the potential for misuse, including concerns about cybercrime, the creation of deep fakes, and the impact on employment. And that's what everything that I just read was generated by Microsoft Copilot. And that's based on OpenAI's ChatGPT. But, you know, it seems like a fairly clear definition. And I think it's pretty fascinating. I'm putting a link in here, and maybe you could share this, Vivian, with the group.
Yes.
This 8 Google employees invented modern AI. Here's the inside story. This is fascinating because what it really comes down to in a lot of ways is they took a semiotic approach to trying to understand text in a way that they had been doing something earlier where it's like the next word, what are the connections between the most recent word and the next word, things like that. And someone came up with the idea that we could just look at all the words in a text and look at their multiple interrelationships. And it just struck me, this is all about semiotics. And I thought that was really cool. So this article is just fascinating. I hope you guys get a chance to read it. Um, I'm going to say too, the reactions to generative AI have really been mixed. Some people are going like, this is the next best thing ever. It's going to change our lives in all these positive ways. But then we've seen some pretty bland kind of material being generated by these chatbots and the other tools that are out there. There have been a whole bunch of questions about, intellectual property, copyright, authorship. Who really owns this stuff? If you're providing the prompts and you're setting things up, do you own it, or is this all owned by OpenAI or Microsoft or Google or any of the other companies that are really engaging this in significant ways? There's been a lot of fear about this. People are saying, well, students are just going to they're not going to learn anything. They're just going to learn how to get the answers and plug it into their exams or to write papers for us. And this is going to be the end of civilization as we know it. I'm a little skeptical about that because I think we've adapted to things in the past, and I'll talk about that later. I think it's surprising how good some of this stuff can be from generative AI, from these chatbots. But on the other hand, they're also prone to creating what the folks at OpenAI have called hallucinations. And if you've been following what Elon Musk has been doing with implanting chips into brains, let's not forget the singularity, because the latest thing I read, I think it was this morning, was that they're looking at these chips having AI embedded into them. And so you can put things in your brain that will allow you to do things in interesting ways. We're a long ways from that, but it's definitely being researched and tested. So kind of scary in a lot of ways. There have been a lot of broader factors informing our perceptions of generative AI. There's just a ton of hype. People are saying, this is going to be great, and a lot of misinformation. That people just, you hear one thing and it sounds good and you repeat it, things like that. There's been a lot of misinformation, and only some of it's justified. And I worry about that because, the more informed we are about these things, the better off we're going to be, particularly as teachers. I think is going to make a huge difference. As I said earlier, a lot of these tools have been in use in industry for more than a decade, although the tools we have now are so much more advanced than those, and the interactions that you can have with the new chatbots and the new tools that they're coming out with is just so much more useful and easy. So it's like, yeah, it's been around for a while. In fact, interestingly, my wife worked for an artificial intelligence company in 1988 and 89 and 90. She was working with Carnegie Group, which was a company that was spun off from Carnegie Mellon as one of the first generation AI companies. It ended up being the only first generation company to make it into the second generation. And trust me, there have been a lot of generations since then, and they're no longer around, which is unfortunate. But the good news is, or I'm not sure it's good news. Basically, it's going to stick around for a while because they're putting it into everything. If you're using Windows, it's right there with Copilot. If you're using Google Docs, then they're embedding into that. If you're using any of the Adobe materials, any of the Adobe Suite tools that they've got out there, it's there, and there's a lot more coming. So it's definitely not going away. The limitations are really worth knowing about. Not very good at coming up with new ideas. I've tested it, I've pushed it pretty hard to come up with new ideas, but really what it is, if you think about it, it's a text predictor. What are the most likely words to come next? But you can get some stuff that will look like it's new if you can really push it to come up with things that are very uncommon but seem useful. And I've been able to get some stuff like that. If you ask it about something like, say, shark finning, which is one of the examples I use in my textbooks, it'll come up with all the big stuff. It comes up with it pretty well, and it's pretty solid information. But if you push it further, you can get, and you kind of narrow it down, you can actually get some pretty good stuff. But the thing is, they're coming from words that other people have generated, that humans have created. And it's not coming from some magical algorithm that supports creative thinking, at least not yet. So let's talk about getting started with AI. And this is more like even before you start thinking about it in your course. But just be aware, we've seen this stuff happen. When I was in fourth grade, I got a $7 calculator. It was a great price, by the way, back then, uh, to use in math. And that was around 1967. And the thing that was really interesting was everybody was freaking out. People aren't going to know how to add, divide, multiply, subtract, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to have a math illiterate society. But, it didn't turn out that way. We had the same thing happen with grammar and style checkers. My colleague Kay Kiefer and Charles Smith had been doing work, really some of the very first work in the field, with AT&T Bell Labs Writer's Workbench. And then eventually the tools that were pioneered by them and really by IBM with their Epistle project ended up moving into Microsoft Word and the kind of things that we normally have in word processors. But the thing was, there was such a strong reaction to this. And some people were saying, we'll never have to teach grammar again. Other people saying students are never going to be able to get noun and verb agreement. There's a lot of discussion going on there. And certainly the web had major impacts on what we do as teachers of writing or as teachers of any kind, really, with the information that's available there. We had social media, which has disrupted so much of our lives right now. It's amazing. So we've had a lot of disruptions that we've gone through. This is the next one. This one is pretty profound, but there's a lot of parallels to the earlier disruptions, and we can learn from how we got through that. So I think that's reassuring in some ways. We're going to figure out the limitations on this stuff. We're going to figure out the affordances, and we're going to be able to move forward. So the question that I'm suggesting is that we rethink this. The question is not whether we can work around these tools, but how we can best understand and address their implications for what it means to be a writer and how we can most effectively teach our students. So it's not, oh my God, this is going to change everything. What are we going to do? Am I going to lose my job? I don't think that's going to be the case, fortunately. But what does it allow us to do, and what do we need to look out for? So reframing the question is critically important. And the third is just we need to understand how these things work. We need to get involved. We need to look at Copilot and Gemini and ChatGPT. We need to ask questions. We actually have to get in there and use them. In other words, get in there, figure out what you can do with it, figure out what's possible. And I think if we do that, we're going to be really helpful. So I want to get into some suggestions for teaching. If you guys have questions or anything, as Evian said, ask me at any time. I think it'll be great. But I'll get into this. And I really want to talk a little bit about before you start the term, before you even get, you're starting to plan your course. There's a bunch of things to consider, and some of them go way outside the course in ways we haven't done before. So I've got like 3 slides on understanding institutional and programmatic policies. So everybody's been grappling with this, and a lot of institutions have come up with policies, some of them very widely. I'm going to talk about the typical ones. They basically say this is not all that different from all of our academic integrity policies that we've had in the past. So, basically in a writing class, you don't want to use work created by a chatbot without, attribution. Otherwise, you're engaging in plagiarism. That's pretty common in these institutional policies. These institutional policies also actually encourage faculty and teachers to explore their uses in their courses. Use these things, figure out what's going to work, what's going to be useful. And that's similar to what I was talking about just a few minutes ago. They almost all point out that instructors are responsible for making judgments about the pedagogical uses of Gen AI tools in their courses. That's pretty important. That's basically saying you have control over this. Now, some schools have been a lot more draconian. You cannot use this, you cannot do that. But the majority of places are saying that, yeah, it's fine. I would encourage you certainly to go look at whether your university has put it out. Sometimes it's housed in your academic integrity program. Sometimes it's housed in your teaching and learning program. Sometimes it's in, administrative units such as a provost office or college deans, things like that. And then they almost all say that you should state your policy in your syllabus, which is, that makes perfect sense. If you have if you have specific limitations that you want to impose or specific conditions under which you can use it, put it in your syllabus. They talk about ethics and using these tools ethically and responsibly. They focus on the importance of engaging in learning. but this is only sometimes, which is interesting to me. The ones that do, they focus on us as we want to use these tools to really help us figure things out. And so, um, when they're talking about writing, they're talking about the full range of writing and research processes. The worst thing that can happen certainly is the students just generate kind of a weak paper that a chatbot comes up with and they turn it in. They don't learn anything. That's not helpful. And so you really want to talk about this in terms of learning. And sometimes they identify both prohibited and allowed use. Not too many do. Not many of the ones I saw actually go into detail. They're more in the area of trusting faculty to know what their discipline is and how they can work with the things. And the final thing about the institutional and programmatic policies is some of them, and I think this is really important, and I wish a lot more would do it, call attention to inequitable access to Gen AI tools. So if you've got, the newest iPhone or fairly powerful Android, or you've got high-speed internet connection, or you've got a good laptop. So these things are really easy to get to. But what if you don't? And so if you're assuming that everybody in your class is going to be able to use this, sometimes the phones are a little bit older. Sometimes the internet connection is not going to be great. So those are kinds of things. And sometimes students, simply don't have access to these tools. So they talk about that. And I think that is a really useful thing to talk about because students with high-end equipment and connectivity are going to be at an advantage over those who don't have it. They sometimes warn against the use of tools that can repeatedly detect AI writing. And I'll talk about this later as well. Those tools don't seem to work all that well. And they often provide false positives, particularly when applied to text written by non-native speakers of English. And I'm not sure why that is, but it's one of those things where if you get flagged by one of these tools, it can really affect your relationship with your students, particularly when they haven't used them. So it's tricky. Although I did see somebody the other day telling me that they found a great way to get really good text out of a chatbot. First, you get a chatbot, you generate the text. Second, you translate it into Romanian. Third, you translate it back into English, and then you turn it in. It's really great. And I thought that is weird, but I can imagine how putting these things together will make it really hard for us to track down people who are just using it solely to generate text. So, all right. I think it's really useful to understand the privacy and data retention policies of leading generative AI tools. In other words, some of you folks will remember what happened with Turnitin.com. There was a big lawsuit because Turnitin.com was ingesting every paper that was sent to them by countless schools and classes across the country. And so that all went into their database. And someone came along and said, hey, wait a minute, you guys are profiting off of all of these papers written by students. You're doing research on it. You're developing new tools based on this. You're making money off of them. We think that's wrong. You should be compensating the students, or at least you should be restricted from doing that. Turnitin.com actually won that case, and they've been able to retain all that. The same thing is going to be the case with all these chatbots. You put something in there, it's going to be used. It's going to be ingested. It's going to be part of it. And so you have to be really thoughtful about this, and you might want to let your students know that anything they put up there is going to be retained by the chatbot. So I saw something about a month and a half ago saying, do not let ChatGPT do your taxes because it's going to hold on to all that information. And if someone writes in, tell me about the taxes of Vivian Garcia, and Vivian has gone out and put some information into the chatbot, I might find out all kinds of stuff that she wouldn't want me to know. So kind of crazy. I would definitely say you should consider the benefits of using these generative AI tools. There have been people that have been pretty against using them. But if you think about what the affordances are, if they're using these tools to create the documents that are spelled correctly and use grammar and mechanics fairly well, then you won't have to be worried about that quite as much. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be teaching this, but I want to think back to what it was like with the calculators coming out. Students are going to learn this, but as hard as they work on it, sometimes they aren't necessarily going to catch all the errors they make in their sentences and paragraphs. So if you suggest that they can run these through in the same way that a spell checker or grammar and style checker would do it at the end of the process, then you might have more time to focus on other things like How can they generate original ideas? How can they consider their audience and purpose? How can they develop their arguments? How can they strengthen their arguments? What kind of information and evidence could they bring in? So um, the cool thing about this is that when you're thinking about a specific writing situation and you're trying to improve what students do, for me, when I teach first year writing, the biggest thing is the shift from just basically putting out information to making an effective argument that, or making an interesting essay or report or document of some sort that interests their readers and helps them accomplish their purpose. That's a huge change. And I don't think that chatbots are really, really good at coming up with original ideas and innovative approaches of solving problems, but our students can and writers can. And if we focus on these larger concerns, we might end up with people who are writing a whole lot better. And the weird thing is, I'm thinking down the road, we're going to see fewer assignments coming in that are really poorly written and have lots of errors in them. I think we're going to see less of that. And I think it's just interesting when you get down to that. The thing you want to make sure is that they don't change your paper, but anyway, I just think this is kind of interesting. If I can focus more on the big picture rhetorical situation and things like that, I think we're in a much better place than if I'm focusing on split infinitives and parallel structure. So we'll see where this goes. I'd also say one thing you want to do is become familiar with something called prompt engineering. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but you want to really provide the chatbot with a clear context and purpose that can guide the creation of a response. And I'll provide more details in this, but you can also provide details that help the chatbot understand the context for a writing project. What that does essentially is allow it to select a slightly different set of texts that might inform the response that it creates. So prompt engineering is going to be incredibly important. Many of you guys are familiar with that. If you're not familiar with it, hopefully this talk will help with that a little bit. Okay. So here's a typical prompt. I'm going to go into some detail on this now. I'm working on a paper for my class. My current thesis statement is blah, blah, blah. How could this be improved? Okay, so that's fine. And what you might do is say information about the persona that the chatbot should adopt, the type of sources it might draw on, the types of readers you're trying to address. And remember, students can get this from the assignments that you provide them, because a lot of time that information is in there. So now here's another one. My current thesis statement is blah, blah, blah. You are a writing instructor with 10 years of experience providing feedback to student writers. You have also studied presidential election campaigns and are familiar with the current political landscape. The people who will read my thesis statement are interested in increasing voter turnout. So you can go in and provide all this information, like with your experience and understanding of my audience, provide suggestions for improving the quality of my thesis statement, then suggest 3 reasons that I could use to support my thesis statement. Cite relevant sources from peer-reviewed publications or reputable websites for each reason. So that's a lot more complicated than how can I improve my thesis statement. Now you're providing it with all kinds of information, and you're asking for feedback on how could I improve this thesis statement and what might be some reasons to support it. That's kind of cool in a way. That might be the kind of thinking you want your students to do on their own, though. And so, but if you understand that students can engage in this kind of prompt engineering, and there's going to be a lot of stuff on the web that will help them do this, then you'll be able to get better feedback on the writing you've produced so far, and so on, and maybe with the inquiry that you do later. One of the final things I want to talk about is considering the role of generative AI tools in learning about a topic or issue. So what I really like it to do is to identify work that's been published in a particular area. I just think of it as a glorified search tool, right? So I can say, what's some of the most recent thinking about international agreements on regulations related to shark fishing? Okay, so it'll show me some of the more recent work that's been out there, and then I could ask it to assess the quality of 3 of the results it's found. So you might ask a chatbot if an article is widely cited. Where it was published was a good publication. It was a reputable journal. You might And you might suggest that students use this process to get started on a literature review, because this is teaching them what it means. What are the criteria you might use to make judgments, right? The downside of this, of course, is that the students are just going to get what the chatbot provides them, but that's not that different than what they get out of a database search or a library catalog search or a web search. So the one thing I'm saying is when you start thinking about using this as inquiry, you want to, as a teacher, consider what you're going to gain and what you're going to lose by using generative AI to explore a topic or issue. And you want to think about, okay, what does this do that a web search doesn't do? What does this do that a database search doesn't do? What are the chatbots typically have a much larger set of documents to pull on than the databases do. So that's kind of an interesting issue. On the other hand, everything in a database is pretty well evaluated, right? It's gone through essentially a peer review process before it was published, and now it's being considered for inclusion based on the types of journals that are included in the database. So you want to be able to explain to your students what's really going on here and what the trade-offs are in using these different tools to learn about a topic or an issue. And the final thing I'm going to say is consider your teaching goals. What are you trying to do? Is this course about developing fluency as a writer, or is it also about addressing audience and purpose and so on? Are you really worried about argument and evidence? Are you really thinking about effective use of sources? Are you trying to teach them something about genre and design? So depending on what you're doing with your class, you want to really think about how these tools might be able to help you and how they might get in the way of the learning that you want your students to engage in. So
Mike, if I may, since you just did that nice first part of before the term, we had a couple of comments and questions come in, so I'm just going to jump in with those.
Sounds great.
Great. So Professor Albrecht Crane, she had a couple of comments. First, she said, I will point out that calculators do not use other people's work without attribution to generate the responses. And then she said, Grammarly has become a fully fledged AI writing tool. It can be asked to rewrite, edit one's writing, or generate entire paragraphs or essays. I believe that AI functionality is available only to users who pay for the pro version, though. So just a couple of items to share there, so I'll indicate those. And then we do have another question. This comes from Professor Hatch. He's asking, what about asking students to verify what the Gen AI gives them? I remember a case where lawyers used ChatGPT to generate a brief, and ChatGPT made up cases.
Yep, those are great points. I think you're right about the calculators. I mean, they didn't pull from other people's work and present it as their own, right? The only reason I brought that up was that the panic that was associated with it. Remember, I was only in fourth grade, but it continued through the 70s, really. And even today, it's like when you go into an engineering class or a class that relies on a math class, you can use a calculator for basic stuff, but you're not supposed to use the graphing calculators and things like that can really do some pretty sophisticated work that you actually want the students to learn how to do. So I use that more as an example of how the initial reaction was a problem, was very strong. I mean, people were really upset about this. I even remember my parents talking about it. People aren't going to be able to count change and things like that. And it was fascinating to see the reactions. And so I remember that. But it's a great point. These chatbots are coming. They just? I won't say they're ripping off everybody's ideas, but functionally, that's what they're doing. And it's really problematic. I mean, you can see what the Times, New York Times is doing, is filing lawsuits against OpenAI and other chatbot or generative AI tools out there. There's value in human generated material, and if we just keep getting it through a chatbot, it's going to be sanitized or created. And Professor Hatch, I love your comment about verifying the results. I can imagine how embarrassing that was for a lawsuit to be proceeding on the basis of made up case law. That would just be incredible. We saw the same thing happening in some of the discussions I saw on the email lists in my discipline, where people were We're saying, yeah, look, I asked, I was getting pretty good responses, and then it generated, Chat GPT is what they were looking at that time. Chat GPT generated a works cited list, and it was pretty good, except for three articles by so and so that I know they didn't write because I'm them. It was about, oh, I wrote all this stuff. It sounds like something I would have written, but I didn't actually write it. So there is that huge amount of problems. So I think that those are great points, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Mike. So
Yeah.
on to the next.
Okay, so as you get ready to design and present an assignment, there's some things to think about. I think the key thing is to clarify the key points at which generative AI tools can and can't be used. My example here that I'm giving is position generative AI as another tool to support inquiry. That's I think the most important thing that you can do. That's one of the things you can do. It's great for inquiry, right? But we know about the hallucinations. The point that was made earlier by Professor Hatch is exactly right. It's like you can't trust it, but you also can't trust a lot of stuff on the web. And so, librarians for years have been talking, about their CRAP model, CRAAP, which I think is a lousy name, by the way. I think librarians should have a better sense of acronyms than the CRAP evaluation model. But anyway, um, they should, basically you can talk about the kinds of feedback you might get from a chatbot, and you might actually have your students to work through and talk about the advantages and disadvantages of these tools during a class session. Like, let's do a search. Let's find out, what do we think about these results? Let's do a follow-up search using a database. Let's do something. Spend 20 minutes working through something to kind of get a sense of what some of the limitations are. You can also do the same thing looking at text that's generated and say, what do you like about it? What don't you like about it? What are some of the weaknesses, right? So I think that's one, if you can position it as a way to support inquiry, I think that's really helpful. Um, I do this all the time. I used to be a cross country and track coach at the University of St. Thomas. It was a Division III school, and I came in working with these distance runners, and I was a pretty good runner myself, so they kind of trusted what I had to say. But I was asking them to do things that were really different than they were used to. And I started explaining why. I said, here's the story. And we're doing this for these reasons. This is why you're taking a day off. This is why you're not running in the morning. This is why we're going to do this. This is why we use this strategy. It was successful. We won NCAAs, which was pretty cool. And we beat a bunch of Division I schools at some competitions. So, it worked pretty well. And after a while, the students were starting to say things like, well, we've had good results. Trust the coach. He knows what he's doing. So that was kind of fun. When I got thrown into a classroom, I didn't know that a GTA in writing studies was going to be the person who was the actual teacher. I thought I was going to be assisting someone, but I started drawing on my coaching experience because the students were about the same age, and I was doing okay. I started telling them stories. Here's why we're doing this. Here's what's going on. And that story becomes a story of the course, and it helps them understand why things are being done in a particular way. So I think it's critical to explain what your rationale is for the appropriate use of generative AI. Now, what do you think is appropriate? Why do you think that's the case? What do you think is not appropriate? Why? When I start working with my students lately, I've been talking to them about their learning outcomes. And I point out that in a lot of cases, if you're really doing a good job in my first year writing course, by the end of the semester, you won't write as well as you did at the beginning. And the reason for that is basic learning theory, that as you get to a certain point where you're pretty good, and then as you begin to incorporate more complex ideas, more processes, more concepts, you start trying to figure it all out. And the worst thing that happens is you do a lousy job of writing, which is kind of depressing in a way. And so when you say, well, I'm not writing as well as I was, I'll say, to me, that's going to be a sign that you're working really hard in this course. And in fact, at the end of the semester, I want to see that. I want to see you struggling, taking chances, doing new things. And I won't expect you to write as smoothly as you did, say, at the beginning, because you're going to be paying attention to more issues. And this is based on research about giving professional writers complex topics to write about. And when you see them doing that, they're starting to make grammatical errors, which is weird because they're professionals, right? But what I do tell them then, 3 months to 6 months after the course is completed, you're going to start noticing that you're really pulling things together, especially if you keep writing, that you're going to start to put everything together, and you're going to go to another plateau. You're going to go right up to a higher level. It's like leveling up in a game. So I tell them those stories, they buy it, they understand it, and they put the work in, and it works really well for me. So tell your story, explain your rationale. I think it's really helpful. Um, you want to help them understand how to use this stuff. You know, they can do it for all kinds of things. They can help generate ideas for a topic. They can help provide information, right? The inquiry stuff I've been talking about. They can provide feedback. They can help you identify useful documents that are good examples. I want to show me some good examples of an essay that has tables and graphs and charts in it. Okay, so they can look at how other people have done it. They can see, well, maybe it looks like the reference to the table is close by, or they can see that they format the table title in a particular way, or they place the the caption for the figure in a particular place, and they provide information about the source of the information in it. So, you can use it to create different types of media. I've used it, for example, to create some of the materials I use in a PowerPoint presentation. Like, give me a line drawing of a faculty member who is surprised, and so that's kind of cool. I'm not putting anybody out of business, by the way, because I wasn't going to pay someone for that. I would have looked down in clipart or something, but these tools can help me generate it. I can ask it to identify mechanical errors in drafts, and that's kind of cool. Again, it's like using it as a grammar and style checker. So you also want to help them understand the negative impacts of replacing the work of thinking carefully about something with just taking whatever a chatbot puts in there. In other words, you're not thinking about it. And it goes back to that story you're telling about the course. You're trying to help them become better writers so that down the road, they're going to be able to create documents that make a difference. And you want to help the students understand your decisions about why it's appropriate or inappropriate to do it. Again, the story. It's going to help them not only avoid engaging in academic misconduct, but it'll also help them learn how these tools can help them grow as writers. So, I mean, I think this is part of the landscape going forward. We need to figure out how to use it, and I think we'll be able to do that pretty effectively, particularly as we share ideas with each other, read the published work on it, go to do things like you're doing right now. Go to a webinar, and you'll pull some ideas out of this that might be helpful to you. Other things you say, no, that's not me. That's fine. We're going to work as a field to get to the point where we have some consensus about what we can do with this and what it means to be a writer in an age of AI. So this is something that's going to be fairly quick. I want you to understand how Gen AI can help you as a teacher respond. And there are some ways that really freak me out and other ways that I think are helpful. I don't know how many times we've worked with a summary where I just don't even know what they're talking about, right? And I look for sort of the surface features. Did they make a main point? Did they provide the key points that the writer was using in that article or something like that? I didn't want to go out and read the whole article. But if you're dealing with an unfamiliar topic and you really are curious about it, you can use a chatbot to learn about the issue and get a general sense of what are some of the key things. You can also do Google searches, and you can do database searches, things like that. But Gen AI can actually help you get a quick look at an issue and just get some familiarity with what they're talking about. So that's helpful. But here's the thing, tread cautiously, because you do not want to use Gen AI tools to help evaluate a large set of student essays. You're going to give better responses than the machine can give, and you're going to understand things in a way they can't. They're basically recognition machines and prediction machines. That's all they are. There's nobody there. At least I hope there's not. You're going to do a lot more with your comments to help them become better writers. So I am so annoyed with saying things about claims that Gen AI tools can, quote, ease the burden of responding to student writing. And we've seen this stuff for a long time. We've seen people hoping that this would happen back in the 70s and 80s. We've seen what happened in the early 2000s about the consequences of machine scoring of student writing. And what was really interesting about this was that they saw, Charles Moran and other folks that were working on this did some really interesting studies in which they looked at who was using machine scoring. And it turned out that at elite schools, four-year private colleges, high-end schools where the students come from fairly affluent backgrounds, they used people to respond to their writing. Whereas at schools that were dealing with lower socioeconomic groups primarily, you saw much more use of this machine scoring. I think we're going to see the same thing happen. I think companies are going to come out with this stuff saying, oh, we're going to make your life so much easier. Go ahead and use this to evaluate your students. I think that's going to be really, really dangerous and really unfortunate. I think there's a reason for teachers to respond to student writing and not to turn it over to a machine. I think it's going to have really bad effects if we start using that. And yet I know that some people are going to have to do it. You know, if you're teaching large number of courses, large number of students, good Lord, look at what happens in high schools. A typical teacher in language arts in, say, a senior high school has anywhere from 125 to 200 students. How can you provide writing assignments and respond to that writing in a reasonable way without working 80 hours a week? And you know, many of us in our field are dealing with large numbers of students, and it's really tricky to find a way to balance our life with what we know we need to do in order to help those students improve as writers. So it's going to be tempting, and it might even be useful at points, but I'd be very cautious about it. I would certainly avoid AI detection tools. We've been talking about that already, so I won't spend much more time on this. But I think one key thing is to know that generative AI tools are already being used extensively by paper mills. You know, it used to be that you can buy a thesis for $5,000. You can buy a term paper for $100 or whatever. Um, you know, the thing that I talked about with translating it, you know, generate the text, translate it to another language, translate it back. It's really hard to detect that. It's going to be almost impossible, frankly, to detect that. And now we know that in these paper mills, people are creating first and second and third drafts with a chat bot, and then they're being edited by a human. And it's really hard to track this down. So I don't think I mean, the people that do a good job of cheating won't get caught, and the people that aren't cheating will be accused of it. It's just a bad situation all the way around. Um, so some closing observations. We talked about Grammarly. I don't like Grammarly. This is what they were advertising in November. I love it. My marketing voice is coming in. Personalized AI everywhere you write. Instantly generate clear, compelling writing while maintaining your unique voice. I checked today to see if that was still up there. It's not. They've changed it. And it's a much more mundane thing. But again, this is part of that, the inequity that we have and the digital divide that we have. If you can afford to pay for Grammarly, you're gonna get lots of, you're gonna save a lot of time. You're not gonna learn as much, frankly. I do not like Grammarly. I never have. I don't know why I don't like it, but I just don't like it. So, I have some questions for you guys. So I'll throw some questions back at you to consider. You know, will students engage in the kind of thoughtful reflection and assessment we ask them to carry out, or will they take shortcuts? You know, with Gen AI in the picture, this is the kind of thing that I worry about all the time. I'm wondering how these tools are going to evolve over time. To what extent, in any, will it erode or get in the way of improving the ability to produce well-written text? And that's coming back to the question about grammar earlier. It is important. Grammar and syntax are important. If students can't write it, what are they losing? You know, if students are relying on Gen AI to produce, you know, clean text, if they're not learning anything, what do we lose? And then what are the most important questions we can ask about generative AI and learning, teaching, and writing? And that's where I'd go to wrap up with that. And so I'm happy to share these slides. I know that Vivian's going to be able to do that for you guys. And I'll just say, you know, I'm happy to respond on email if you guys want to reach out to me at any point. And I'm happy to do responses to more questions.
Okay, Mike. This one comes from Professor Albert Crane again, and she brought up a really interesting point. I hope it's okay that I post another question. Of course it is. Ask as many as you like. She received an email from a student asking her about a dilemma they were facing. The email was clearly AI generated. I found myself not knowing what to think or do. Do I
Yeah.
respond in a way? Do I refuse to respond and tell the student because on some level I don't want to talk to an algorithm? I think we're facing many situations we will not know how to handle.
Yeah, let me take that one because I don't want to lose track of what I'm thinking about here. The very first project I got involved in as a graduate student, and I don't know, some of you guys know this, I'm an accidental professor. I only went to graduate school because I wanted to keep my marriage alive. We'd been married a few months, and my wife said, I want to get a master's degree. I had a business in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and we had to move to another city to go to grad school. So I went with her. And I didn't know a whole lot of stuff about what was going on, but they threw me as a graduate student into this study of how high performing and low performing students, really all students, but they particularly those groups of students interacted with the teacher. And they were really interested in technology, like would email help students who are shy or reluctant in some way to talk to the teacher uh, react more positively. It turned out that when they had access to email, they were more likely, if you were a C or D student, you were more likely to actually ask questions of the teacher. So here's the interesting thing. Students are nervous about talking to teachers. They're intimidated, particularly some of them are just shy. Some of them, want to take some time to think about it. If the best way they can do that is to ask ChatGPT to write, or Gemini or whatever it is, to write a draft of an email and send it to you, it's probably okay because they probably are trying to figure out how to ask it. I mean, you don't want to, yeah, I would get annoyed, if I'm thinking I'm just talking to the chat bot, but I'd temper that with the memory of that particular study because it did turn out that when students had access to email and chat and things like that, they were more likely to interact with their teacher than when they didn't. So maybe this is the only way they feel comfortable reaching out to you, in which case you could say at the end of your response, hey, you feel free to write your own response, but I'm happy to talk with you anytime. Come into my office. I really appreciate you reaching out. Something like that. I think that's a great question, and it's kind of a real change in the way that we're thinking about our relationships with students. So thanks for that.
And that was a great response, Mike. Very empathetic. So for next, Professor Ahern asks, I'd love to hear you speak a bit more about Gen AI and inequity. I like that you identified access, but in addition to false positives for ELL students, students of color are disproportionately accused of Gen AI misuse when they work with EOP tutors or the Writing Center. Also, if we are playing, a quote, or encouraging play, how do we balance environmental concerns and in particular with clean water when BIPOC communities will disproportionately, yes, be affected by environmental impacts? I know this isn't super solvable, but how do you balance these issues of use with students?
We've seen the same thing. I'm directing our writing center right now. I've been doing it for about 3 years. It's been this really satisfying work, but we're seeing more and more of our tutors coming back to us with questions. But I think this is AI, and so we've done a lot of professional development on that. How do you respond to that? You know, it is tough, and you don't know for sure whether it's generated by a machine and they're just coming in to get it cleaned up and make it look a little different so they can turn it in without doing much work, which is really not what we want to see, or if it's a case of a false positive. That is really tricky. And you're right about students of color and BIPOC students. Folks who I'm just trying to think, it's just so hard right now because we can't tell. You can look at something and go, oh, I think that's like that. But some of our students write that way. They've been trained to write in ways that are similar to what ChatGPT and Gemini and Copilot will generate for them. So, or maybe now they've seen enough of it that they're starting to write that way. So it's really hard to know. And I don't know what to do about it. The larger question you're asking about, and I'm not sure if I fully understand the second half of the question about the impact of Gen AI on either solutions to dealing with clean drinking water and environmental issues, or the impact of all of these huge server farms that they're putting together to generate the responses, because I think that's actually a huge issue. And they're putting a lot of those into rural areas. And so they're having some impacts on communities that are typically left well off. I mean, you don't see if those of you are familiar with the Twin Cities, you probably don't see some of the wealthier suburbs getting huge server farms, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe that'll all change as we become more aware of the issues. But I'm a little more worried about the inequity issue in terms of setting up server farms that they've got and the impact that's going to have on uh, generating power and climate change and all the other things that are going on there. So I wish I had a better answer for the second half of your question. And I wish I had a better answer for the first half of your questions, frankly, because I think it's an issue that we're all going to have to grapple with for a long time.
And I hope you don't mind, Mike. A few more questions have come in if we want to go through those.
Sure, that sounds
Yep.
great.
Okay. So Professor Fujimoto asks, does what you call mechanical errors include grammar and syntax? These are things students need to learn by thinking about them. They are not insignificant, not in bold. And then she also did a PS. Grammar and syntax are not insignificant in context of producing clear meaning intended by the writer. How is it an advantage to just let the machine do it for them?
Yeah, I agree with you. It is really important. The one thing that I would say to that is, well, how can I'm struggling with this a little bit because on the one hand, the research indicates that, attention to grammar, and this is like for more than 120 years of research on writing that they've done a bunch of meta-analysis. When you focus solely on grammar, it doesn't help you become a better writer. But when you focus on grammar in the context of your writing, you do improve and you want to do that. And so strategies like grammar logs and sitting down with students and helping them understand the moves that they're making and why they want to do it in certain ways are critical to helping them become better writers. So it's not insignificant. On the other hand, it depends on the purpose of the course. So I've got like three hands going up right now. So on the third hand, you want to be able to identify students that are struggling with this stuff. And if ChatGPT is cleaning up everything they're doing, how are we going to know it? And yet on the fourth hand, we've got, if that's what they're using all the time to generate it, and they're just basically coming up with good ideas and making good arguments, and the documents they're producing with the help of generative AI are relatively clean, where are we at? And I'm going to say I had a graduate student that I worked with last year who had dyslexia, and worked really hard to do a good job with their work, but couldn't really always recognize the errors they were making. And there were many times when I was working with them where I said to myself, "You just tell them to run that paragraph through ChatGPT, it'll probably improve it." But I never did because I wanted them to continue to struggle with it and to work with it and try to become better at it because they needed to do it. We're not always going to be able to rely on these things, and sometimes they're going to change our writing in ways that we don't want them to change it. So I think it's a really tricky question. In the long run, I suspect that people are going to rely more and more on these things to clean things up because they're integrated into Word, they're integrated into Google Docs, and I think it's going to happen that we're going to spend less time noticing errors because the stuff that's going to come to us is going to be largely error-free. So if when people get to the point where they don't have Gen AI to help them out and deal with their writing, they're going to really struggle. But the question is, how often will they be in that position in a fairly networked and interconnected world? So these are tough questions.
Yeah,
I
no,
wish.
you're getting really good ones. And I'm going to
Yeah.
summarize Professor Wayne's question a little, but it's
Okay.
essentially getting at the effect of energy use distribution on the environment. And his question is, should any discussion on Gen AI also include a discussion on what current bills and acts Congress is dealing with to help regulate Gen AI and why it might be good to regulate it? Feels that if people are more aware of the unseen effects of something, they're more thoughtful about how they use it and why.
I agree. That's a great way to clarify that because you're absolutely right. And we're even seeing that with things like all of these cloud-based computing, right? When it was just stuff on our computer and on different drives, that was one issue. But my gosh, these data centers are gigantic. And even without Gen AI, we're getting huge amounts. Or look at crypto mining, right? Another huge impact on the environment because of that and crazy stuff like that. So I think you're making a great point. Thank you for that.
Professor Bailey said, this is more like an interesting example that she had asked a student for permission to use her AI generated extension request email as an example for the class, and that they used it as a genre exercise with the whole class to look at how badly ChatGPT had failed at concision and tone.
That's cool. I love that. That is exactly the kind of stuff we should be doing. Let people recognize that this is going to produce kind of average text. I mean, I have seen people work with it really hard, work with a generative AI tool. There's a LinkedIn Learning lesson that I worked with maybe about 3 or 4 months ago, where this person was talking about prompt engineering and how they were able to get fairly good text out of it. But it takes more time to do that than it actually would to write it yourself. So I thought that was interesting. But I think that's a great example of exactly the kinds of things we want to do. So thanks for that.
And Professor Watson had a couple of comments. She confronted 8 international students last semester. None denied her strong assumption about their AI to use of AI tools. And she thinks if one has a strong background in second language acquisition, it is easier to identify illegal borrowings. So
I think you're right. But a lot of us don't have that expertise that you have, Dr. Walton. I mean, it's like when you know the patterns and you can see what's going on and you go, this just doesn't seem like writing that these students would produce, then you've got the basis for a good discussion. And, you know, maybe you'll be surprised occasionally, but I'm sure you're right about that. I had a question from one of my colleagues. He's a linguist, and he was working in a class, a TESOL TEPL class. And he contacted me and didn't write to me. We talked about it. And he asked if it was a form of plagiarism to use a translation tool, because what the students were doing was writing their answers to writing their papers essentially in their home language, in their native language, and then translating it into English and then working with it some more. And he wondered if that was plagiarism. Frankly, it isn't. It depends on the goals of the class. In his case, he wanted them to understand linguistic concepts. And, it didn't seem to matter whether they did that, understood it in English. In fact, writing in English would get in the way of the kind of sophisticated thinking he wanted them to do. And so I said, in your case, probably not plagiarism and probably not academic misconduct. They're trying to work with the ideas, right? But if it's a writing class where you want them to learn how to have fluency in English and to develop strong English writing skills, then absolutely it's not what you want them to do. It's a terrible idea for them to do that. So it's tricky, isn't it? I mean, dealing with things, you really have to understand the context and goals of your class. You have to understand where your students are at. I really appreciate the comment that you made there. I think that's really helpful.
And Professor Hatch has a question and a comment. So the comment first is about a student submitting a slightly revised essay where their first one got 0% on Turnitin AI's detection, whereas the revision with just a few changes got 80%. So that was the comment. And then the
Huh.
question is, could it be fair to say that we need to put the impetus for learning on the students? So sure, you can use Gen AI to check your grammar and syntax.
Mm-hmm.
And are you treating it like an editor and not reviewing it? Or are you checking the differences and using it as an opportunity to learn where your mistakes or problems were and how to improve them?
Yep. That's the perfect situation. If they start saying, okay, what am I learning from asking for these corrections and changes? One of the things I've seen with ChatGPT and Microsoft Copilot is they'll often say to learn more, do this. They're starting to get a little more nuanced in terms of what they're doing there. But again, I keep going back to my notion of what's the story of your course and helping students understand why you're doing certain things and why your policies are the way they are and how they're going to move through the course and what they're going to benefit from is really at the heart of this. And, we're always going to have students that are just saying, they want to complete the course or they want a grade in the course and they don't much care about anything beyond that. It's always difficult to deal with students who come in with that goal essentially. But the students who really want to improve as writers and who see value in the course, it's exactly the right way to approach it. So learning how to benefit from the corrections or the feedback you're getting from ChatGPT is helpful and it probably and they can get it right away. It's like just in time kind of feedback. And so that's helpful as well, as opposed to looking at something that's coming back from a professor a couple days later. If they can get that feedback right now and it's accurate, which is not always the case, then that's going to be beneficial to them, particularly if you've given them the framework for understanding how to work with that feedback. So I think that's really great.
Professor Garabone was wondering if you could speak to how oral presentations or examinations might be an integral part of the work done in writing classrooms.
Oh, yeah. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? The only downside I can see is the number of students we typically have to deal with. But I will say that when we first started working with computers, I started working with computers in a writing classroom in fall of '87. And I was at Carnegie Mellon University where they had all kinds of great technology. What I've learned, and we did some studies on this, a couple of major studies, when teachers were working with students in those computer supported classrooms, the students would be writing during class. Usually at the beginning of class, we'd have 5 or 10 minutes, and sometimes the students would show up 10 minutes early just so they could get started working on what we called a daily writing assignment, where they just would maybe work on their introductions or something, or maybe they'd come up with ideas, and then we'd sit down and talk about them around a table with their backs to the computers. Then they go back to the computers, and they would often talk with each other about stuff. But what I found really useful at that point was the idea of a quick conversation, anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 minutes, where you're just sitting down and you're working with that student and you're having a really intense interaction with them where they are getting exactly what they needed at the point when they were drafting something. I think that's really helpful. Doing kind of exams where you're asking them questions, I think given the number of students you'd have to work with in a given day, it would be really tough. But if you put them in groups, had them do stuff, it can work out really well. So I'll give you an example of something I did recently. My students always have trouble writing literature reviews. I want them to talk about what's the conversation in the community, what are people writing about, what do they care about, what are the key issues. And I kept getting things that were basically summary after summary after summary and way too much detail, making me do the work as a reader of trying to put it all together. So I put them into groups and I said, okay, I want you guys to get together. Here's a question. How are you going to explain this issue that the 4 or 5 of you who are working on a shared topic are working on? Explain it to your 12-year-old cousin in words that they can understand. What are the key issues here? What's really going on? And they came back and they gave me the best overview of the issues I've ever seen in spoken words. And then I said, this is what I want to see in writing. So I think you can do that, and I think there are ways to pull it off. I just worry about doing that with, say, 20 or 25 students and trying to figure out how to make that work. I think it's tricky, but in group work and getting them to talk, I think it's great. And in those individual conversations while they're doing something and walking around the room and talking to them face to face, I think it's great. You can do some of the same things online, but I particularly like doing it in a face to face classroom. So good
We
question.
have
Thank you.
Yeah, lots of great questions here. We have a question from Professor Liu. What tools do you use to check essays that use AI to generate ideas, and how do you evaluate these essays?
I don't. I don't use tools to check on it. I kind of look to see what they're doing. Um, at this point, I'm still really leery of thinking that I'm going to be able to detect AI writing. So I don't do that. But I do look at the quality the ideas are coming up with and wondering whether, if one of the best ways to determine that they're coming up with their own ideas is if they've got bad ones or things that have been done over and over again and proven to be bad ideas. You almost kind of hope that your students are coming up with their own ideas, even if they're not ideal, right? So I guess I use experience, and I've got the advantage of almost 4 decades of teaching writing. So I rely on that more than anything else. I don't have any tools that help me with it.
Okay, next question comes from Professor Janowski, who says, currently CCAT exams often used in screening job applicants allow only pencil and paper for math and no help for verbal and
Yep,
spatial reasoning. Leaning on AI will not help prepare students for these types of exams.
you're right. You're absolutely right. And that's got to be part of the story that we're telling our students. This is why you need to learn this stuff. That's a really good. We ran into that when I was hiring people as web developers for our online programs. Oh my gosh. You know how hard it is to find people who can actually code front end? I'm going to call it HTML and CSS, who can actually do a good job of that. They don't teach that in computer science. The person we ended up hiring most recently was a textile designer who ended up teaching herself HTML and CSS. It was bizarre. And we would have people come in that, they've got a degree from a really prestigious university as a computer scientist, and they're amazing what they can do behind the scenes. But they couldn't do anything. They couldn't design a website. They couldn't organize a website effectively. They couldn't do the kind of coding that we wanted them to do. And it's fascinating. I've had this discussion with my son numerous times. He does fraud analytics for North America for Visa. He's got a team that works with him on that. And it's The stuff he can do is just beyond anything I can do. But he says, I can't code that. I can't code a website. I think we're going to be in the same boat. We're asking people to sit down and actually do the work by hand. That gives us a real insight on what they can actually do. And again, go back to that story, explain that to your students and say, this is why we're doing this kind of stuff. And you're only, here's another little thing that we used to do. When I was a distance runner, I still am, but when I was competing seriously, and we used to joke with the kids I was coaching, but even with my friends when we were out doing a workout, if someone was really having a hard time and they had to cut the course short, a little bit like cutting the angle on something instead of going all the way around something to keep up with us, we'd yell at them, "You're only hurting yourself." Well, that's kind of what I feel like with Gen AI. If students don't put the work in to really learn this stuff, then they're only hurting themselves. And again, that has to be part of the story that we're telling them. I'm not saying don't use it. I'm saying use it effectively, use it appropriately, learn how to be a writer, but be aware that over reliance on these tools is not going to be helpful in the long run.
And this is more common. Professor Waits Richmond said, in the 90s, I averaged 125 ninth and 12th graders. I did it all
Yes.
by hand, and I did work many hours per week.
Mm-hmm. And there are a surprising number of people who are in that situation and do the work that you're doing, and that is so commendable. And unfortunately, there are people that say, I can't keep up. And so the number of papers assigned to their students becomes vanishingly small. I wish, I just don't know where we're going to go with all of this, but we need more teachers. We need better salaries. We need better working conditions.
Yes to all of the above, Mike.
Yeah, I was a community organizer after I got out of college, so that shows through sometimes. Okay.
And then Professor Wayne wanted to thank you for answering his question before. But that's it for the questions, unless
Oh, that's
anyone
great.
has any others. I know we're a little over, but thank you for sticking with us. And as I noted earlier, we'll be sharing the recording and the slides. And Mike, thank you so much for taking the time. You just had some great insights, wonderful presentation. I'm hoping everyone will be able to take something away from it that they could take to their own classrooms. Oh, something else came in Q&A. We've got thank you so much, great information and suggestions. So
Great. Thank you, guys. I'm glad. I really appreciate you coming to this, and I hope you find some of this stuff useful. So good luck with your teaching, and thank you.
yes, thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Take care, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.